Chief of the Forest Service and former Director of the Bureau of Land Management, and let us not forget a fishing guide for 11 years out in the real world, Mike Dombeck, one of the most sterling conservation leaders of the last 100 years. His accomplishments are too many to list, but near and dear to the hearts of Montanans are his protection of the incomparable Rocky Mountain front, his commitment to protecting the Rock Creek watershed from a proposed mine inside the Cactus Mountains wilderness, and dearest to us all, his agency's implementation of the roadless rule, which, as he would be the first to tell you, was not his rule, but the people's will. On July 1st, 1998, the 100th anniversary of Gifford Pinchot's first day of working for the U.S. Forest Service, Mike sent a memo to all Forest Service employees and stated, "If we are to redeem our role as conservation leaders, it is not enough to be loyal to the Forest Service organization. First and foremost, we must be loyal to our land ethic." When Mike Dombeck was chief, we used to visit about the Kootenai country a lot. I tried not to abuse that opportunity, nor burden the busy schedule and mind space of this extremely courteous, gracious, kind-hearted man by filling it with reports of which individual timber sales, and indeed which individuals, were being naughty and which ones nice. So I was often tempted. Instead, we talked about two things: wilderness and forestry. His office directed our fledgling group, the Yak Valley Forest Council, in stewardship forestry matters. We went to Washington and lobbied for roadless areas protection and community and restoration forestry. What invigorated us most about these visits and about the effect Mike had on the agency during his tenure was, of course, the sterling old-school conservation ethic he brought to the agency and the on-the-ground protection of 58.5 million acres of roadless land, the unprotected, irreplaceable backcountry, wellspring of our community's dreams, imaginations, clean drinking water, clean air, jobs, and wildlife. But on a more human level, the prideful, zestful spring in the step of Forest Service employees who had previously been beaten down for decades, proud specialists being told they were bureaucratic, black-hearted nincompoops by extractive industry representatives and environmentalists alike. Being pressured always to place the thing we all love most, wild forest, wild country, last. Mike was so moderate, in my opinion, it was revolutionary. He wanted to harvest timber, restore damaged watersheds, restore the agency's good name, and protect wilderness. Of course it made sense. It made so much sense, and Mike would never say such a thing, this is only my own editorializing. It made so much sense that the Bush administration didn't and doesn't get it. Every once in a while, once every generation, I think, if we're lucky, an area or region or nation is blessed with an individual for whom public service is the highest calling and who uses his or her power with unprecedented generosity and vision. The genius of Mike Dombeck is that he is a warm, caring man who loves humanity as much as he loves the wilderness. Indeed, a tough task for some of us some days. A Wisconsin native, a passionate deer hunter and fly fisherman, father and husband, now teaching at the University of Wisconsin, Mike manages to somehow keep a full private life in addition to his exemplary and ongoing public service. It is a measure of Mike's civility, his lifelong commitment to the wilderness, that he has, with typical humility, always attributed his success in implementing the roadless rule to the help of his co-workers and the guidance of his conservation predecessors. I admire the work he has done and continues doing for wilderness and community. He will be the gold standard of public service for the next generation. But I want to close by reiterating that I admire him as a man and a friend, a person of character, even beyond Mike the conservationist. We are in the presence of a great and humble, caring, courteous spirit. These days, that is sometimes as rare as a grizzly in the Bitterroots, a caribou in the yak. He was and is as rare and yet vital as our diminishing wilderness itself.
With that kind of introduction, I hate to speak and let you all down. And remember, Jan, I borrowed your there's a lot of talk about Washington and local control, and there are several people in the audience here, like Matt Mellenbach, that I worked with in Washington, and I learned something when I got to Washington. And I grew up 25 miles from a town of 1,500 in northwestern Wisconsin, but never dreamed of going to Washington. But what I learned when I got there is almost everybody is from someplace else, but it's a great place to blame. And yes, there are people like Max Baucus and Conrad Burns and Pat Williams and George Bush and a whole variety of people like that. But the reality is, right, Matt, most people are from someplace else. But Rick also mentioned that I spent 11 years guiding where I grew up in northern Wisconsin. There was really only two things that kids could do back in the 50s and 60s, and that's you could work in the woods, cutting and peeling aspen. And if you had ever done that with the wood ticks, mosquitoes, the black flies, and oceans, the gnats, the humidity, not a breath of air moving in June and July, and then you get out on these beautiful lakes with the breeze blowing the bugs away. Like fishing was for me. It was easy. And little did I know that 25 years later, my office would overlook the body of water in Washington, D.C. that produced the U.S. record carp. And this is no fish story. It was caught in 1983 out of the tidal basin and weighed 57 pounds. And my office was within 300 yards of that place. Now, I know some of you with gray hair probably think of the tidal basin and you think of Wilbur Mills and but there is fish in there. Well, thank you for the gracious invitation to come and talk to you here in Bozeman. I'm not from Montana. I wasn't born here. This is my second favorite place in the world. The first one is where I was born, in the Lake Country in northern Wisconsin, which extends up into Michigan, Minnesota, and Ontario. And my second favorite place is where Rick lives, and western Montana and northern Idaho. And I've had the tremendous fortune of having been in all 50 states and to many of the wildest places, as well as some of the most developed places. But I haven't come here to talk about personal stories. I'm here to talk about the land. And I want to start out with a word that's been injected in our vocabulary just within the last couple of years, and that's the word security. Of course, it's been in the dictionary for a long, long time, but certainly since September 11th, it's become part of our daily lives. We have a new cabinet-level department, the Homeland Security Agency. We're concerned about protecting the security of our borders. We initiated a war or military action in Afghanistan to protect the Afghani people and the rest of the world from the terrorists that were in that country. We, with Britain, initiated a war in Iraq in the name of national and international security. And our Congress recently appropriated $87 billion in the name of national security. So hearing this term over and over again has caused me to think a lot about what it really means, especially as it relates to the land and natural resource management, where I've spent a good share of my career and my life, and I've often thought about what it really means to be secure. And I'm talking about secure over the long haul, not just this year, next year. And yes, I support the effort against terrorism, chemical weapons of mass destruction, protecting our families, our loved ones, our soldiers. But are these the only threats we have to worry about? What about the threats to our long-term security, the threats to the air we breathe, the land that we depend upon, day after day after day, generation after generation after generation, for our livelihood? There's a report called The Conquest of Civilization over 7,000 years. published in 1953 in its USDA Circular Number 90, and its author is Dr. W.C. Loudermilk. And he was the assistant chief of the Natural Resource Conservation Service, what was then the Soil Conservation Service. And he was a PhD soil scientist, geologist, traveled around the world in the 1930s looking at civilizations and what caused the downfall of many of the civilizations millennia before his time. And he came to a couple of conclusions. It was usually misuse of soil and water over the long haul. And I encourage you to go to the website or dig out USDA Circular Number 90 by W.C. Loudermilk. It's wonderful reading mostly about soil erosion and water quality. And I think we've got some real life examples of that today. And this takes me to Iraq. Now think about what this place once was. Baghdad, the Tigris and Euphrates River, the Fertile Crescent, one of the two great cradles of civilization. Agriculture, as humans know it today, first evolved in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. And think of the images that we see in the newscast today of what this once lush green, well-irrigated, productive landscape was, and we can arrive at a couple of conclusions. It's the result of too many people pushing the land too hard for too many generations. And yes, there's been climate change, and yes, there are other reasons. But what we see today is we see a barren, hard landscape that once held human populations in excess of 25 million, and today it's about 4. And it all relates to the long-term human relationship with the land. And stories like this are still unfolding today. China, the Gobi Desert, over the last couple of decades, has expanded by over 20,000 square miles. At the same time, China's food production has fallen below levels of consumption. And this is to support 1/6 of the world's population. And that's a mind-numbing fact globally, that we've got 1/6 of the world population that can't feed itself. And we haven't even begun to talk about Africa and other places like that. And we're not free from this in the U.S. The U.S. is fortunate. We still have places like the Bob Marshall, like the Rocky Mountain. But we also have our problems. We also have not had the time as a society to have the impact as the cultures that have lived in China and in Baghdad. But the fact is we're losing about 40,000 acres of coastal wetlands each year. And these coastal wetlands are nursery, spawning, or rearing areas for 3/4 of the commercial fisheries that we depend upon. 40% of the fish stocks in the U.S. are depleted. And there's example after example. But in the name of national security, in this term that we hear probably every hour or more, I want to talk about sort of common sense conservation. And for the sake of simplicity, I want to talk about 10 issues. And most of these issues largely relate to public land management, because that's where I had my career. And there are issues like population, like global warming, that are overarching issues that must be dealt with globally. But if we were even to begin to address them here, it would take us not only till 4 p.m., but till 4 a.m. in the morning. So I want to start with water. And this is the issue that I believe is the issue of this century, and probably this millennium. The United States Economic Commission stated that 2/3 of the world population will be suffering from a water shortage within the next 25 years. In China, we've got 400 cities today that are experiencing dire shortages of water, and this is drinking water. We think about the fights over the Colorado River and what it once was, and what the delta of the Colorado River is today. The largest water tank in the United States States is the overall aquifer that stretches from South Dakota to Texas. Much of that water was deposited 40,000 years ago when the ice sheets retreated. And today we're extracting water from that aquifer 40 times faster than it's being replenished. And in some places it's anywhere from 10 to 100 feet below once measured levels. When that tank is dry, we got a problem. I live in the Great Lakes area. Dr. Jack Heaton is in the audience, who I haven't seen for years. That's probably the most famous fisheries professor from that part of the country that's retired here in Bozeman. And Jack knows this. 20% of the fresh water in the world is in the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan is the 5th largest Great Lake. Mayors of the 4 largest suburbs of Chicago have said that fresh water is among their major problems. Now ask yourself, in just a common sense way, how can this be? How can you be on the shores of the 5th largest lake in the world and fresh water be a problem? If we were in the Southwest, we could see where that would be a problem. Well, as Forest Service Chief, I had a speech that I used to give called the Forest Service, the world's largest water company. And one of the things you get to do as you play in the briar patch of public policy and have the vice squeezed on you from all sides, as the BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, other employees in the audience here know, is that you're always reaching out for positive issues, ways to communicate issues that are so important. And lots of people care about timber, lots of people care about grazing. But if we take a look at the roots of the Forest Service itself, that say no national forest shall be, at that time they said reserves, because they were called forest reserves until 1905, that no forest reserve shall be established except to provide favorable conditions for water flows and provide a sustainable supply of timber for the American public. And somehow it seemed like we forgot about this water business as we got into the zeal of the post-World War II timber boom and moved to meet the demands of the nation. And yet, if we really want to engage people in conservation and natural resource management, and I'm not talking about the people that are in this room, but the people that are not, most of the American public doesn't care about timber, as long as they have a house to live in. Most of the American public doesn't care about grazing. They don't care about riparian areas. They just simply don't understand the issues. But one thing they do need on a daily basis is water. So as Chief of the Forest Service, I chose water to be the primary thing that I talked about, time and time again. And the reality is that the cleanest water in the United States flows up to our forested landscapes and public lands. In fact, truly, 1/3 of the U.S. is forested and it produces 2/3 of the runoff. If we take a look at national forests alone, they cover about 8% of the surface area of the lower 48. They produce about 14% of the runoff. Again, this disproportionate value of water. And yes, we knew the value of a board for the timber, a ton of coal, an ounce of gold, and a barrel of oil, but we didn't know the value of water coming out of the national forest. We put a team of people together, led by Dr. Jim Siddell, and they found that the marginal economic value of water flowing from the national forest was $3.7 billion a year. And by marginal, this means something to those of you that are economists. This is valuing water at $2 an acre foot in the west, in the east, and $4 an acre foot in the west. And if my math is right, an acre foot is about 356,000 gallons. So that's really not inflated very much. But the point is, how many people in the United States understand the objective is to keep water on the land longer, to recharge aquifers. That's how we prevent soil erosion. One of our biggest challenges is communicating the values of why it is we're gathered here and why land is so important. And one of the reasons I went and stayed into the land management business is, to me, land is sort of the core value of how wealth is generated, what quality of life really is. And yes, we live in a high-tech society, but it simply still all boils down to food, soil, water, the spiritual connection with the land, the wild places, biodiversity that's so important. And in my view, one of the best things we can do is just hammer the communication of this issue of water and where it comes from. And the watershed management and watershed function is really the basic interaction of soil, vegetation, and water. And yet, as director of BLM or chief of the Forest Service, not one single land developer came to me and said, Mike, you better be doing a better job of watershed management. And yet, look at the water-limited communities in the United States, especially in the Southwest. People just are not making the connection. And my charge to you is help them make that connection. I forgot to mention my second issue, land fragmentation and sprawl, briefly. A few statistics. On the average, about 3.2 million acres per year of forest land, wetlands, open space, and farmland are converted to more urban uses. And that's double the rate of the previous decade. That's 8,700 acres a day. That's an area each year twice the size of the state of Delaware. Even in areas where urban areas where population is declining, like Detroit, like Des Moines, Iowa, we see the urban areas increase. As land fragmentation increases, tract size diminishes. Much of our wildland fire problem is a fragmentation issue. We have houses today where we didn't have houses not too many years ago. If we take a look at forests from 1978 to 1994, the proportion of private forest ownership, 50 acres or less, doubled. And what that equates to is taking thousands of parcels, large parcels, and carving them up into literally millions of small parcels. I mean, this brings real meaning to Will Rogers' famous quote, by land, they ain't making it anymore. And if we take a look at some of Aldo Leopold's predictions, he said, many years ago, he said that, made this prediction, and that's 50 years from now, the acquisition of public game lands will be recognized as a milestone in the evolution of a democratic government. Well, that prophecy certainly came true. If we take a look at our congressionally designated wilderness, 104 million acres, much of it rock and ice. Not nearly enough. We're missing major ecosystems, no bottomland hardwoods, and no tall grass prairie. And somehow the stark reality of maintaining large unfragmented tracts of land, which is largely maintaining the status quo, is lost on those that call themselves modern-day conservatives. To me, a conservative was someone that maintained the status quo. Today it seems to mean something else. Modern-day conservatives seem to define a roadless area as something in need of roads. And I won't even get into the Forest Service roadless issue, although the scars are healing, and the bottom line is the road building era is over, in spite of what this administration does, or any administration, because yeah, there may be a few miles if things are relaxed, but the values simply are not there. There's a reason these areas are roadless. Much of this is economically driven. So I'm not really overly worried about entry into roadless areas beyond the symbolic importance of communicating and understanding the value of what it is. I noticed this morning there was a question about wildland fire, and I can't talk about public lands without at least touching on a wildland fire. And it's really about the urban wildland interface, sort of a fancy term for something that's half wild and half Walmart. But if we think about the 400 million acres in the United States today and about 73 million of national forests that are identified as vulnerable to fire, much of it is in the western United States. I can't tell you how many fires I've been on in this state over the years. But there's something to be learned from all of this, and I always like to talk about Smoky, because Smoky was the most effective conservation education campaign probably in the history of the world. According to the polls in 1968, Smoky was the second most recognized character in the United States. Number one wasn't Mickey, it was Santa. Indeed, more people knew who Smokey was than could name the president. And we could get into the forest health issue, which we might in question and answers, but the reality is we have changed a lot of things. We've got 100 years of fire suppression, and I got to tell you, we've got the best wildland firefighters in the world in this country, with a track record almost second to none. 98% of the fires are put out in the initial attack. And from the standpoint of probably any land manager, when you look at the big picture of fire, it's really a very frustrating thing. When do we fight fire? When it's the hardest and the most expensive. When does fire season end? When it rains. When we suppress fire, what are we guaranteeing? That we're saving it to burn another year. So my conclusion of that is we have to completely rethink our whole relationship with fire and with the land and our sort of human zeal to want to control nature and think that we can wrap all this up. And we just, it's almost like we've got to start over in thinking about fire. And let me just give you a couple of examples. The second most expensive fire in the history of this country was the Spilt fire, which was southwestern Oregon, 2002. The most expensive was the Yellowstone fire, 1988. Well, the media reports told us that the 500,000 acre biscuit fire destroyed the landscape. This is the picture, the image that's broadcast all around the entire United States every morning when you turn on the TV. At noon in the evening of this tragedy. Well, according to the burn area assessment team, this is what they found within the perimeter of the biscuit fire. 16% of the area burned with high severity, 23% moderate, 41% low, and 20% was unburned. Seems to me that might be about the way Mother Nature would have done it. Well, our challenge, and I'm not here as a total let's burn proponent, but our challenge is to put fire back on the land, to learn how to live with fire. It's our communities and our houses that are new. The forest evolved with fire. If the forest couldn't withstand fire, we would have no forest. And yet, as homeowners, the single most important thing you can do to protect your house is not out in a roadless area, not out in the wilderness. It's within 200 feet of your house. And you can talk to Jack Kahn, who works in the fire lab in Missoula, and he will tell you this. In fact, I think he says it's 40 meters. It's really the determining factor as to how much property is destroyed. And yet we look at the immense cost of this, and wildland firefighting is very different from structural firefighting. And every time you add a structure in a forest, you're adding $10,000 to $50,000 to the suppression cost, and the bills skyrocket, and the public is irate. And all I got to say with the Healthy Forest Initiative, and many components of it are steps in the right direction, is that I hope that the Bush administration is intent on implementing a balanced Healthy Forest Initiative as they are on rolling back mining regulations, water quality standards, and other things like that. If not, it'll quickly turn into the black hat of the salvage rider of the post-1994 fires, and if it turns into a law gets to save us, there will be more gridlock than we're experiencing today. We have that opportunity in front of us if we do it right. I want to mention my issue number 4 just very briefly, and that's the loss of biodiversity. If you haven't read E.O. Wilson's book called The Future of Life, I recommend it. It's an easy read. He's the world-renowned expert on biodiversity, and he doesn't paint a gloomy picture, but paints a picture of something that's very important, and that's the need to preserve life, all forms of life, the genetic library that we evolved from, the diversity in nature. And I'd like to read a quote, one of my favorite Aldo Leopold quotes. And He was giving a speech to the planners of the passenger pigeon monument. He was overlooking the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers, and this is what he said. And I quote, "There will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images, dead to all hardships and to all delight. Book pigeons cannot dive out of the clouds to make a deer run for cover, nor flap their wings in thunderous applause of mass-laden woods. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind. They live by not living at all." It seems to me that the richest society in the history of the world ought to have as a primary tenet the protection of all forms of life, and wild places are the repository of the biodiversity that we have today. Exotic species. So we've not only managed to diminish our natural ecological heritage, we're also busy rearranging it. We're flying seeds, germs, plants, animals around the globe on a daily basis. I used to go up to Alaska quite a bit, and sitting on the tarmac at Anchorage, you see a whole fleet of 747. Anchorage is one of these global stopover places, and I used to think to myself that I get home without getting sick because every germ in the world must be in this airport. And we can talk about exotic species for a long time, but you know, leafy spurge, 5 million acres in 23 states, economic losses, $200 million. Yellow star thistle in 12 states. In fact, yellow star thistle is interesting because California had to remove it from their noxious weed list. Because in order to be on the noxious weed list in California, that species has to be controllable, and yellow star thistle is just too far out of hand, and it's just breaking the law, and we don't know what to do about it. Think of how Dutch elm disease changed the looks of our cities and towns. White pine blister rust, white bark pine at the higher elevation. We got melaleuca in the Everglades. You know what our best defense against invasion of exotic species is? Protecting our undisturbed landscape. Because the one thing in common that we see in exotic plants, invasive plants, is they thrive on disturbed landscape. And this is the cheapest way. Old growth forests. I could talk about this issue for a long time, but I can say that it seems like the neoconservative definition of old growth is senile trees. That belong in a home. Particularly a 2x4 or a 2x6. But this is truly the issue that has perplexed the Forest Service for several decades. The spotted owl issue was really about old growth. Much of the roadless issue is really about old growth. And the reality is that the American public realizes there's just a very little left. This is part of our heritage, and they don't want it commercially harvested. And recently, Jack Ward Thomas and I wrote an editorial calling on the Bush administration to call a halt to all commercial harvest of old growth on public land. Now notice I didn't say that means no management in old growth forests. The reality of it is, I had 2 remaining unfinished pieces of business before I left the Forest Service, and one was dealing with old growth, and the other is that the agency badly needs to revamp its business model for vegetation management, and stewardship contracting is a step in the right direction. We've just got to get it out of our heads that we're going to pay for land management of timber, because the fact is that the values aren't there. And the business management model that is based on today was from the big timber era when we were harvesting lots of old growth back in the 60s and 70s. And that day's over. The values just aren't there. We need to rethink that completely. For example, I don't know many private landowners that would sell a property right on their land. And yet that's precisely what we do with timber sale contracts. And the model is very simple. We need to determine the condition that we want on the land. We need to hire the contractors. to do the work, and we need to monitor. And we need to deck the wood that we remove and have a public auction at the spot value of the day. It's not much more complicated than that, but as those of you that deal with timber sale contracts and all of the ramifications of it know that there's history and there's policies that are just intractable, that add complexity to all this. I want to mention what I think is the most perplexing issue for the public land managers today, and that's based on what I've heard from BLM managers, Forest Service managers, and that's the issue of off-road vehicles. Tougher than the spotted owl issue, tougher than most. And just think about it. We've got more people going more places with more kinds of equipment than any time in the history of the world. Off-road vehicle use on the national forest alone increased from about 5 million users a year in 1972 to about 36 to 40 million last year. The reason the issue is going to be so tough, and I got to commend Chief Bosworth for making this one of his 4 threats to the national forest, and I really wish the Forest Service and all the agencies well in resolving this thorny issue. And I wish it would play in the arena of a land health, but it won't. It'll play in the issue of it's my right, similar to gun control, and it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with, but we need to get on with it. My issue number 8 is the 1872 mining law. Here's a law that was passed when women couldn't vote. When St. Louis was the last frontier to a lot of people, and we as a nation were struggling and distracted by the Reconstruction after the Civil War. We all know it's a blatant giveaway of public resources, privatization of land, $2.50 to $5 an acre. But to me, the most egregious part of the 1872 mining law is the public land managers have the responsibility to make a decision whether or not to move forward with an action on the land based upon human health and safety and environmental condition of the land for all resource issues, whether it's a timber sale, an access site, a trail, a campground, you name it, all except one, and that's hard rock mining. And that just simply shouldn't be, but yet it's an issue that somehow evades our ability to deal with it politically. It was almost dealt with in 1973, with Congress having adjourned. If Congress had gone along another week or so beyond that, we would have had revisions at that time. I can tell you about some of the mining waste problems in this state, but I'm sure you all are aware of it. And so I don't go till 4 o'clock. I won't even begin to cover that, other than that I hope that this administration, let me start over, I wish it hadn't chosen to relax the conservation provisions that were enacted by BLM in the 1990s to protect more land from this egregious, outdated law. Private land conservation, the controversy for natural resource management is typically fought on public lands. In fact, the national forest, the BLM lands in particular, are really the wrestling match for how people view natural resource policy and perhaps